الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. All of the advanced students of Hadith, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant you goodness. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase you in knowledge and love of the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. We welcome all of you to our second lecture, in which we will be discussing some of the techniques and principles that the scholars of Hadith used to detect some of the hidden defects in Hadith. And we talked in our previous lecture about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose from amongst His ummah those great and noble and knowledgeable scholars to preserve one of the great aspects of His revelation, and those are none other than the scholars of Hadith. And we said today that we're going to mention some of the different principles and techniques of some of those great scholars in trying to detect some of the hidden defects that were found in the Hadith. And this knowledge that we are discussing, okay, ilm al-ilal, knowledge of hidden defects, is the highest level of knowledge related to the sciences of Hadith. And this science within the sciences of Hadith is one of the most intricate and one of the most complex sciences from amongst all the other sciences of Hadith. So today we're going to talk about the complexity and the difficulty of discovering hidden defects. So discovering hidden defects in a Hadith, as we mentioned, is one of the most intricate branches of knowledge related to the Sunnah. And hidden defects, they cannot be detected by the naked eye alone, except for the masters of Hadith. So rather, detecting these hidden defects within the narrations, it requires expertise, it requires mastery of all of the sciences of Hadith, all of the abwab related to mustalah Hadith. And for one to even scratch the surface of trying to attempt to discover a hidden defect in a narration, one must first master mustalah al-hadith. They must first master the terminologies, okay, of the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But not only master mustalah hadith, they must also master the names of narrators and those individual narrators' narrations. And it is necessary to not only be well versed and skilled with certain hadith terminologies, but also to keep in mind that many of the scholars of hadith differed in their definitions and their conditions of different types of hadith, and differed as well in their implementation of those terminologies in their books and in their compilations. So there is no way of acquiring a thorough understanding of the knowledge and techniques of discovering hidden defects except through numerous years of extensive research, of extensive practice and mastering it hands-on through trial and error. And one of the first steps into gaining experience and prowess in discovering hidden defects is mastering takhrij, mastering referencing of the narrations, in which you bring reference to the narrations and refer them back to their original sources and original compilations. And when doing takhrij, okay, when you gather and categorize and analyze the different routes of transmission and the different wordings within the text, okay, and also you look at the different levels of accuracy and preciseness of the narrators, and you compare between the different chains of narration. So the fruits, okay, the fruits of mustalah al-hadith are acquired and manifested through takhrij, and analyzing the different chains of narration to a particular hadith. So whenever the scholars of hadith suspected that there may be a hidden defect in a narration, what was one of the first things that they would do? They would first gather all of the different chains of transmission for that one text. Then they would analyze the different roots, compare them and contrast them with the other roots, while remembering all of the other existing supporting narrations, the corroborating evidences, and also the biographies of certain narrators. So the art of discovering hidden defects in the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is like no other talent, no other experience, or no other skill. Rather, some of the scholars, they say that it is inspiration and intuition that the scholar of hadith is born with. Many times the theories and principles studied and memorized within the books of mustalah have different applications when it comes to the practical implementation in dealing with the narrations hand-on. So the scholar who is able to detect hidden defects in a hadith is similar to a doctor who memorizes the symptoms and medications needed for the flu. At first glance, the doctor may look at a patient and think that the patient has certain illnesses, but after further investigation, after further testing and examination, the doctor's diagnosis is different than his initial diagnosis or what he learned in medical school. However, the more experienced and tenured physician may know exactly what the patient is suffering from as soon as that patient walks through the door, by observation and without any checkup or physical examination. So this is similar to how the experts, the masters and geniuses from amongst the scholars of hadith were skilled in regards to discovering and recognizing the ahadith that contained hidden defects. Some of these great scholars would recognize the hidden defects at first glance, while others would need to investigate the chains of narration and the texts for weeks or months on end. And this all depended upon their level of knowledge, their level of memorization, their skill, their experience, their insight, and the success that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed them. So what is the goal and what is the intention of learning the different techniques of discovering hidden defects in some hadith? So the main goal of these series of lectures is, number one, to increase the student of knowledge's appreciation of the sunnah and the scholars of hadith, and also to increase the Muslims' awareness and appreciation of the sunnah and the scholars of hadith, and all of the efforts that they put forth to preserve, to convey, and to understand and to explain the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And another goal from doing this series of lectures is to introduce the Muslims, and specifically the students of Islamic knowledge, some of the techniques that were used by the scholars of hadith in discovering hidden defects to protect and preserve the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, unfortunately, those who haven't studied hadith or the sciences of hadith too much, some mistakenly think that knowledge of hidden defects, that ilm al-ilal, okay, the knowledge of hidden defects revolves solely around jarh wa ta'dil, solely revolves around criticism and praise of narrators. While knowledge of discovering hidden defects, okay, knowledge of ilal, it does have somewhat of a relationship with it, but this branch of knowledge, okay, how to discover hidden defects, it doesn't revolve around the criticism of narrators. Rather, it is more complex and more intricate than that. And this is why it is at the peak of the sciences of hadith. So discovering hidden defects in hadith revolves around discovering some of the mistakes that trustworthy narrators made, that the thiqat made, and that which necessitate that one's narrations cannot be accepted. So many times they may not be discovered. Many times these hidden defects may not be discovered by just observing or reading the chain of narration and referring back to the books of Jarh wa Ta'dil. And these defects, they cannot only be discovered by only considering adala and dabt, okay, the religiousness or the preciseness of a narrator, okay. Rather, this science is the science of ilal, of discovering hidden defects, is directly related to whether a narration can be considered sahih or whether it cannot be considered a sahih. Because we know that a hadith of sahih has 5 conditions that must be met for it to be considered sahih. Number 1, it must have a connected chain from the beginning to the end. Number 2, the narrator must be religious and upright. Number 3, the narrator must be precise and accurate in what he's narrating. And number 4, the narration must be free from containing a narrator that narrates something that contradicts the narration of a sounder or more stronger narrator. And number 5, the narration must be free from defects in its chain or in its texts. So, brothers and sisters, dearly beloved students, knowledge of discovering hidden defects and learning the techniques is extremely important for the students of knowledge, and particularly for the students of hadith and the students of the sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So having knowledge of the techniques of discovering hidden defects that our scholars used aids not only the students of knowledge, not only the students of hadith, but also aids all scholars. It aids the scholar of fiqh, the scholar of aqidah, the scholar of tafsir, to distinguish between the weak and authentic narrations attributed to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So without this knowledge, a scholar or student of knowledge may unintentionally ascribe something to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he didn't say, nor did he approve of. And having knowledge of these sciences, of the techniques and principles to discover hidden defects in hadith, enables the scholar to select and follow the best and the strongest of narrations, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us in the Quran, right, to follow the best of what was revealed to you from your Lord. So discovering hidden defects within some of the prophetic narrations and clarifying them to the ummah is also a part of giving advice. Ad-Dinun Nasiha is also part of giving advice, and also part of preserving one of the main sources of Islam, which is the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa ala alihi wasallam. So in this treaty, in this treaty that we're discussing, in this series of lectures that we're going through, we're going to talk about many different topics. From amongst them, we're going to talk about what is an illah, what is a hidden defect, what is a hidden defect, what does it mean linguistically, what is it technically. Also, where did the science emerge? Where did the science of discovering and clarifying hidden defects emerge? Also, we're going to talk about the importance of knowing hidden defects. Also, the status of this science of hidden defects within the sciences of hadith. And then we're going to get into the techniques and principles that aid the student of hadith in finding hidden defects in narrations, and also the techniques and principles that the previous scholars of hadith used. And then we're going to talk about some of the causes for hidden defects. So the reason why we decided to discuss this topic is because, number one, I haven't come across any lectures that discuss this topic in detail, and also to increase the Muslims' appreciation of these great scholars of hadith, and to appreciate their strenuous efforts, their care, their concern, and research that they contributed to Islamic scholarship and the Sunnah in particular. as there are a few books that have briefly touched on the subject of ilal in English, okay, but not exclusively. Okay, there is a book by Muhammad Hashim Kamali, called A Textbook of Hadith Studies, where he talked about this science in brief, not in detail. Also, Hadith Muhammad, Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's legacy in the medieval and modern world by Jonathan Brown, which mainly talks about the methods and history of Hadith criticism, but doesn't actually talk about how to discover hidden defects in particular. Then you have the very famous book, The Authority and Importance of the Sunnah by Jamal Zarabozo. He also mentions it, but about 2 pages. And then you have Dr. Mustafa Sabai's book, The Sunnah and Its Role in Islamic Legislation, which is only about 5 pages long. So we don't have any series of lectures or any actual compilation which actually talks about the techniques and principles that the scholars of Hadith used to discover the hidden defects in the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, inshallah, we're going to talk about this evening, what is the definition? What is the definition of a hidden defect in a Hadith? So the word illah, ayn, lam, ta marbuta, which it can be translated to mean a hidden defect, as we've been translating it as. It can also mean a blemish, a mistake, or a fault or deficiency in a prophetic tradition, either in the text or the chain of narration. As we know that the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad SAW are composed of 2 parts, the text and the chain of narration. But it also has, let's look at the linguistic meaning first in the Arabic language. So the linguistic meaning goes back to 4 common usages. Number 1, it means repetition or to repeat itself. Number 2, it can mean an obstacle. Number 3, it can mean a weakness in something. Or number 4, it can mean to be distracted or taken away from doing something. Okay, so in the language, the scholars have used many different wordings to talk about these hidden defects. Okay, Ibn Salah, the author of his great book, Al-Muqaddimah, as it is well known, Muqaddimah fi Ulum al-Hadith, or Muqaddimah Ibn Salah, which is one of the fundamental books that a student of Hadith should study well, should research, should review on a regular basis. He uses the word mu'allal. Okay, when he wants to talk about a hidden defect in a hadith, he says mu'allal. Okay, mu'allal, mim, ayn, lam, lam. Okay, however, Imam al-Iraqi, who is the great scholar who authored many books in hadith. His most famous book is Alfiyat al-Iraqi, okay, which he actually derived and used Ibn Salah's book Al-Muqaddimah and turned it into 1,000 lines of poetry. Okay, Imam al-Iraqi, he was from a Kurdish family in Iraq, and then he later moved to Cairo, and he was one of the leading scholars, one of the leading Shafi'i scholars of hadith in his time. So he is the author of Al-Alfiyah. Okay, so he said in his explanation of Ibn Salah's Muqaddimah, called At-Taqeed wal-Idah, that it is better to use the word mu'al. It is better to use the word mu'al with 1 lam instead of 2, because the linguists of the Arabic language use it to mean something to be distracted or taken away from doing something. So there is another usage, okay, which is more common and more popular, even though there exists much different in regards to its usage amongst the scholars, okay, which is ma'lul, 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 mim, ayn, lam, waw, lam, ma'lul, okay. So this usage is more common and more popular, okay, and there are many scholars who have chosen this terminology, such as Imam Suyuti, Imam al-Nawawi, Ibn Salah uses it, Al-Fayruz al-Abadi, he uses it in Al-Qamus, Ibn Sayyida, many of the scholars of Arabic linguistics use this as well. So there are also other scholars, okay, who said that this linguistic usage of the word is correct, such as Az-Zajjaj, who is also a great scholar of the Arabic language, Al-Jawhari in his book As-Sihah, Ibn al-Qutiyah in his book Af'al, they mentioned that this usage is correct as well. Also Al-Matrizi in his book Al-Mughrib, and Ibn Hisham, and Al-Zarqashi, and Al-Fayyumi. And the majority of scholars of hadith use this, such as Imam al-Tirmidhi, Imam Daraqutni, Imam Ibn Adi, Imam al-Hakim, al-Naysaburi, al-Bukhari, and many others as well. And also the Usuliyun, okay, the Usuliyun and the Fuqaha, they also use the word ma'lul to talk about the hidden defects in narrations. So the strongest opinion in this issue, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, is that it is more proper linguistically to say أعل الفلان الحديث, أعل الفلان الحديث, يعله, and the hadith is what? معلل. So it is also acceptable to say أعتل الحديث. Then the hadith would be what? Mu'tal. And this is the wording that Ibn al-Qattan uses frequently in his book Bayan al-Wahm wal-Iham. And other scholars of hadith from Al-Andalus, from Spain, such as Imam Abdul Haq al-Ishbili and his book Al-Mu'tal min al-Ahadith. So as for the technical meaning of the word illah, then each group of scholars, according to their specialty, have derived their own particular meanings for the word. As for the scholars of hadith, then we will mention in detail the different usages amongst them, along with the most common and most popular usages. So as we mentioned, the jurisprudence theorists, okay, the usuliyun, and the scholars of jurisprudence, the fuqaha, use this term, okay, they use the term illah to mean the determinant legal factor which is close to the sabab, which is close to the legal cause. Okay, the scholars of usul, they don't mean most likely that the hadith has a hidden defect or mistake when they use the word illah. Also the scholars of qira'at, the scholars of Quranic recitation, they also use this terminology illah. Okay, and it is a very good concept to come across, which we find in many of the books of qira'at, okay, and they use the word illah and the sciences of Quranic recitation to mean the reasoning behind the different qira'at, which means why a certain recitation is correct or incorrect. So the usage of the word illah amongst the scholars of hadith, okay, they use it to mean, as we mentioned earlier, okay, they use the word illah to mean a hidden defect in the hadith that impairs it or causes weakness in it, even though it seems apparently authentic to the naked eye. And Ibn Salah in his Muqaddimah, he says, quote, "Know that identifying hidden weaknesses in a hadith is one of the most important disciplines and one of the most subtle and noble disciplines. Only people with good memories, vast knowledge, and penetrating understanding can be skilled in it. A hidden defect refers to hidden and obscure elements that impair the hadith," unquote. So the best definition, and Allah knows best, in my opinion, is what Imam As-Sakhawi, who was from the great Shafi'i scholars of hadith, fiqh, tafsir, Arabic adab, tarikh. He was born in Cairo and lived in a village called Sakha in Egypt. And his proficiency in hadith and its sciences go back to one of his greatest teachers, who was Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, rahimahumullah. And one of his most famous and beneficial works in hadith sciences is his book. All of you should write this down. Fathul Mughith. Fathul Mughith, which is one of the most beneficial books that were ever written about the sciences of hadith. So Imam Sakhawi died in the year 902 after the Hijrah. So he says in his book Fathul Mughith, he explained in Illah to be, quote, "It is a narration that is apparently free from all defects, but is later discovered, or it later becomes apparent after research and study." Okay, so let's break this definition that Imam Sakhawi used. Okay, so from this definition we can conclude the following. Number one, it is a narration. And any part of the narration can contain a defect, either the chain, the sanad, or the matan, the text. Number two, apparently free. So when observing the apparent characteristics of the narration, the chain and the text both seem apparently authentic. Before gathering the different chains of narration and routes of transmission and comparing and contrasting them all. So many times, okay, it is not apparent to the eye that there is a hidden defect. Number three, it is later discovered after research. So the hidden defect was found or discovered after gathering up the different chains of narration and the routes of transmission. Then it is discovered after studying the chains and text collectively, comparing them and analyzing them. And number four, the defect in the narration impairs its soundness and authenticity. So based upon this, brothers and sisters and students, we can say that in order for a narration to be considered to have a hidden defect in it, then two conditions must be met for it to be considered mu'tal or ma'lul, to be defective. Number one, the defect has to be obscure or it has to be hidden. And number two, the defect in the narration negates its outward appearance of being sound and authentic. So with these two conditions, okay, the following should not be considered as a hadith that are mu'tal or ma'lul or defective. Number one, okay, defects that are apparent when observing the chain and text, such as the narrator being a liar, okay, because this would go back to the sciences of jarh wa ta'dil, or whether the narrator be known to be a liar, or the narrator lying in that specific narration, or a narrator being known for his open disobedience or for his weak memory. That's number one. Number two, the type of defects that do not impair the soundness of the narration. طيب? So Imam Ibn Salah, he also mentions in his Muqaddimah, he says, quote, "So, a hadith with a hidden defect is one in which scholars have found a defect that impairs its soundness even though it appears to be sound. This impairment then affects the chain of narration, which is composed of reliable narrators and which apparently fulfills all the conditions of a sound hadith." So some scholars have used the word illah generically. In other words, for any narration that contains any defect, whether apparent or inapparent, such as the narrator being a liar, making mistakes, or the chain being disconnected, or a successor of the companions narrating, or from the tabi'een narrating directly from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ while omitting the companion. So this would also depend upon the scholar himself. And some defects, as we mentioned earlier, some defects may be apparent to some scholars, while others may be hidden and unapparent. So what does this depend upon? This all depends upon the level of knowledge, the level of memorization, the level of expertise and understanding of that particular scholar. Imam al-Tirmidhi, rahimahullah, he used the word illah to mean that an abrogated narration, even though it is sound, has been affected by something that necessitates not acting upon it, such as being abrogated by another text. So we can conclude from what we learned about the linguistic meaning of illah and the technical meaning of illah according to the different scholars, and specifically the scholars of hadith, that the usage of the term illah amongst the scholars of hadith is the specific usage that Imam al-Sakhawi mentioned in Fath al-Maghith that we mentioned earlier. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase us in knowledge and love of the sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala open our eyes and open our hearts to acquire some of this great sacred knowledge of the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so that we can appreciate the sunnah, appreciate the scholars of hadith, and understand the great juhud, the great efforts that they put forth to preserve, to take care of, and to protect the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to transmit it from one generation to the next. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase you all in goodness. And until next time, bi'idhnillah, we will see you all in our next lecture, and we're going to talk about briefly about the history of the emergence of this science. So, salam alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you. Jazakallah khair wa barakallahu feek.